Greetings and welcome to part 3 of the renovation of an Irish Land Commission cottage. Firstly, I'd like to say thank you to everybody who's watched the preceding parts. The response has really been quite overwhelming. I certainly didn't expect the number of people who have watched it and the number of people who've commented. And I have to say, your comments are lovely. It's obviously struck a chord with many people, and certainly many of the Irish viewers have their own experience of an Irish Land Commission cottage. And I've also learned a great deal. There's been some very useful information that's come in regarding these cottages, so a big thank you. So this episode concerns the water supply, the electricity supply, the sewerage system, and the rebuilding of the chimneys. I'll bet you can't wait. But it's more interesting than it sounds. But I'd like to begin by having a look around the outside of the cottage. We're going back to September 2022. We made an attempt to clear the front, as you'll see, and then we have a wander round the back of the cottage. So have a look and I'll see you back here a little bit later. So here we are, September 2022, and we're back at the cottage trying to clear a pathway at least to the front door and chop down some of the grass and the weeds that have grown in abundance. Sam there with the collapsible waste bag, they're a great idea. And the task is slightly overawing, and I'm looking here at the shovel, and I'm looking as Sam is beginning to rake up, and the little hedge trimmer, and I'm getting that moment out of Jaws where he says, I think we're going to need a bigger boat. I think we're going to need a bigger spade. In fact, I think we're probably going to need a digger out the front. Now, who says a man can't multitask? Here we are. This is the road outside the cottage. At this stage, we could actually park there. They've since built a house down the hill, so that's no longer parking for us. But we were the last house there on the hill. Now, I do talk about the old cottages. And when you leave the house, you walk down the hill here, and the old ruins are on the left-hand side. This is the old Hayes house. Sadly, most of the houses now have more or less gone back to the land, disintegrated or become overgrown. It's a great shame. I'll just slip in a little photo here that my dad took back in the 70s. And you could still make out most of the dwellings that were there. There were 135 people living on that hill at the beginning of the century, 1901, according to the census, and it ended up with just Eileen left there. To the rear of the property, we have the cow shed and the hay barn. Eileen had these built in the early 80s after she'd sold the cottage on the opposite side of the road to the Rabins. Sadly, it's somewhat disintegrating, a mixture of salt air and high winds. Structurally, I think it's pretty sound, but the corrugated tin has been falling off the sides of it. And it's a job for another day. I'm not too sure what we're going to do with it, but at the moment we'll class it as a work in progress, I think. To the rear of the property there's around about 6 acres of land, but it was described by the valuing agent for the purposes of probate as of very poor quality with a high rock outcrop. This basically means that much of it isn't able to be used because it's purely rock, and the land that isn't particularly fertile. So currently my cousin Faulkner uses it for silage, which is basically grass that's grown and then cut and then baled up and used for animal feed during the winter. I'm afraid my knowledge of farming extends to Jeremy Clarkson, and that is about it, if I'm honest. To the rear of the property, there's fuchsia hedging, which is quite prevalent over Ireland. It's very pretty, but does obviously require a fair bit of maintenance, and this particular hedging has really gone somewhat out of control. Between 2016 and 2022, we obviously had a long period of time to think about what we wanted to do with the cottage. We did discuss varying ideas of extending and possibly doing something with the porch on the front, but ultimately we decided that actually we kind of liked what was already there, and that was perfectly sufficient for the two of us. I've lost count of the number of people I've known who've decided to extend a house just as the children are leaving home, but maybe that's just a kind of British thing. It's brilliant as a home for two of us, and the rooms are sensibly proportioned. They're not huge. And because Eileen extended it at the back, there's room for, quite a large kitchen. We need to reconfigure a few of the rooms slightly inside and possibly knock through a wall between the kitchen and the lounge. But more of all that later. What we did decide, though, is that we want to preserve it for as long as possible. And when we pass it on to our children, that they have got a cottage that they don't have to keep spending money on. So we went through everything we could possibly think of connected to the cottage. And by that, I mean the water supply, the sewerage system, the electricity supply. And we wanted to update it and upgrade it and make it fit for purpose. So this episode is about the main services that are going to be connected to the cottage and the lengths that we've gone to or had to go to actually carry those tasks out. So let's talk water. My parents bought their first house in 1955 in Keam in Plymouth, an end of terrace 33 St Albans Avenue. I was born there in 1956, so I'm still waiting for the blue plaque, but hey ho. So in 1955, when they bought it, it had an outside toilet, but it had running water, it had a sink indoors, to wash at. It had a sink to do the washing up at in the kitchen. And my dad, who was quite handy, managed to put a bathroom in the house. By the time my parents came to Ireland in 1977 to visit the family, we were living in a 4-bedroom detached house with 2 bathrooms and a cloakroom downstairs. By contrast, they still didn't have running water at the cottage. My mum and dad took their caravan over, which was the joy of my dad's life, his caravan, and they would get the water by going to the pump about a quarter of a mile down the road from the house and filling up their plastic container, as you can see in these photos that my dad took. The cottage still had its water from that pump, and you can see the milk churn on the back, which was used to transport water. There's Paddy the horse, and there's Eileen, and there's Uncle Jack there. So that was the way they collected the water in 1977. In 1978, my grandfather paid for them to have a water supply laid on. This involved a water diviner coming out and finding where the source of the water was. Once you've established your water source, you then drill down to what's known as an underground aquifer, which is fundamentally an underground reservoir The water that sits down there has been filtered through the rock and the chalk and gravel and so forth that lies underneath the land. And you drill down to it, you feed a pipe down to it and put a pump on the end, and you pump up the water from down there, and that provides you with a private water supply. So let's take a look at ours, and it's looking rather the worse for wear. It obviously sits outside, although it's enclosed. The lid has somewhat disintegrated, and there's a sheet of corrugated tin on top, held down with the obligatory rocks and breeze blocks. We need to replace the lid, which Finbar, our builder, did. All of the internals, all of the pipe work, the pump, we had replaced by a local water bore company. So there's a new compressor in there which keeps the pressure up, and you can see the new electrics and so forth. We are trying to make sure that we do everything properly so it will last for years. So the complete renewal of the system, but at least we didn't have to start from scratch. My dad took these photos of Julia and Eileen, my mum, round about 78, 79, of the freshly installed water pipe. My elder brother Stephen, sadly no longer with us, visited with his first wife Rhonda, and she remembers that they were so delighted that they'd finally had running water installed, but she was very bemused as to why they'd fitted the tap outside. You will also see from the outside tap that there is a flexible extension pipe, which presumably linked that supply to the cowshed. Anyway, running water had finally come to the cottage in 1978. When I was a young boy, we would often holiday down in Brixham in Devon, which was the home of my grandparents, Michael and Jean. Michael was the Irish grandparent who was brother to Jack and Julia, who lived at the cottage. Now, my grandfather used to have a couple of bottles of water there that he said were magical. They came from Topodarity. Now, it was later explained to me that Topodarity was a spring at Renovating that had magical healing qualities to it. Now, my dad took the photos that you're going to see here of Topodarity. Doesn't look an awful lot, and I think it's been covered over since by the farmer who now owns the land. But my grandfather was convinced of its magical qualities, and this was the best water in the world, and this was healing water. Now, it has been said to me that it was good for curing aches and strains and so on and so forth. But that might have been because the water that came out of it was so cold that if you put any lim in it, it would basically numb it. But who knows? So let's talk electricity. Now, the electricity is fed via overhead cables. These are mounted on tall wooden poles. This is very common across rural Ireland. And from the nearest wooden pole, the cable went over to the top of the chimney. Then it was fed down the side of the chimney, down the roof, and then through the back of the house to the fuse box. Now, the fuse box, as you can see in these photos, is quite frankly dangerous. It's certainly seen better days, and it wouldn't be able to cope with modern electrics. So obviously that had to go. But what we also became aware of, I think it's ESB in Ireland, you're no longer allowed to feed the electricity to the chimney on a house. So it has to be fed to the nearest pole, and then it's fed down the side of the pole and then underground. and then into, in our case, the back of the house to feed into the new fuse box. Now, when it's initially fed in, you have to coordinate having a digger to dig out a trench. You have to coordinate the people from ESB to come and connect things, and then it's fed into the new fuse box, and you end up with a double socket, which basically gives you the very basics of electricity in order to work on the house. So you can see here this fuse box with the two sockets at the side of it. So this is March 2023. We've arrived in Ireland. First thing we've done is go up to the house and look at what we've got. We've actually got a white box on the back of the house. Very exciting stuff. And all of the electricals inside the main meter on 8 units. And we're thrilled. It's a first step and one of many. Here it is on a slightly better day. You can see the old cables hanging off the side of the extension there, and you can see the very smart new box. This is a letter written by Julia early in 1978, and she's referring to the house opposite the Hayes house, which I call the Robins house. And she says, "We got the electricity in the other house. Well, I mean, we have the wiring done. Only in the kitchen, though. One light and one plug. And the same in the stall. The stall she's referring to is the old ruined barn next to the house. They put the pole near the stall, but haven't got the wires connected yet. So the rest of the wiring is waiting for you, Rodney." Now, when my dad went over, he always went over with his toolkit, and he ended up being an electrical and mechanical engineer. He used to lecture in both in the old technology colleges we had over here. He put in sockets in the house, in the Hayes house, because basically the rooms had no plugs in them. So if you look at the walls here, the conduit running down the walls into the double plug sockets, that's my dad's work. He put those in 1977. And he did a lot of wiring for all of us. And if I go up into the roof space of my own house, I can still see his writing on some of the beams where he's making a note of the colours of the wires and where they went and so forth. It's quite comforting. It's probably something I suppose we've lost in the digital age. It's such a personal thing, handwriting. Now, I've included the letter to obviously highlight the fact that the second cottage didn't even have electricity laid on until 1977. And then obviously it was a single light and a single power point. Very different to what we were used to in the UK in 1977. So let's talk sewerage. Well, somebody has to. There's an infamous story back in 1938 when my grandmother first visited, and they're sitting there all having a nice cup of tea, and she asks, "Can I use the bathroom, please?" And they point to the field, because obviously there was no inside toilet. Insofar as I'm aware, there wasn't even an outside sort of privy of any description. I've certainly never seen one in a photo. So I imagine they probably used chamber pots and went outside and had a hole in the ground. I'm really not too sure on that, and it's not a question I ever asked. However, in the early 80s, when Eileen had the extension built, a bathroom was incorporated in that, and a new septic tank system was installed. It's placed to the right-hand side of the cottage, probably some 50, 60 metres away from it. Now, when we looked at it, it seemed in a pretty poor state of repair. I don't think it had ever seen any maintenance, and I don't think it had ever been emptied. So it was a fairly easy decision to decide to start afresh. We decided we would renew the complete sewerage and drainage system. It seemed to make best sense to us, so we ordered a new septic tank and decided that we would locate it again to the right hand side of the cottage, just slightly away from the old tank system. Now, to the right of the cottage, the ground slopes away quite dramatically, but on the right hand side you have the best views. So we knew that we had a digger coming because it had to dig out the trenches for the electricity cables to go from the pole to the house. And we'd also asked if the driver could basically scrape the front and around the cottage so we could see what we were doing and we had a bit better access. And so while he was here, it made sense to us to build up to the right hand side of the cottage so that we could have a garden and a patio there. You have the best views from the right hand side and it's quite sheltered there. So this seemed to make sense to us. So we're going to look at now a video I took in the late 1990s of the rear of the house. And you will see first, we're now on the left obviously as we're at the back of the cottage. You will see how the land slopes away from it. You will also see that there's an old car there. For those of you that don't recognise that, that is a Hillman Hunter of something like, I think, 1978 vintage. Now, this was one of Eileen's cars that she had, and when it died, as was the usual for her cars, she parked it up and it rotted away, basically. Now, if you fast forward to 2016, the photos that I took to the right-hand side of the cottage, you will see that the said car is somewhat disintegrated. It has in fact virtually disappeared. There's still the engine and the steering wheel, but such is the corrosive salts from the ocean. So within 20 years, just under 20 years, the car has gently rotted away there. So talking of cars, the Hillman Hunter was the first car that I'd actually supplied to Eileen. I've spent most of my working life in the motor trade amongst various other things, and my parents actually bought that from me and took it over to Ireland for Eileen. At the time, I don't know if this is still the case, but it was actually cheaper to bring a car over from England and pay the import duty on it than it was to buy the same model in Ireland. As I say, I don't know if that's still the case. Subsequently, my parents bought all of Eileen's cars for her from that Hillman Hunter. That was her Ford Sierra, there was a Vauxhall Carlton, Rover 414. They came via me, but my parents always paid for them. They would never have told you that in a million years, but I can tell you that with a great degree of pride. They were very kind, modest people, and they took Eileen under their wing insofar as Eileen would let anybody take her under their wing. She was a great driver, Eileen, and she loved going out in the car, and obviously it's a lifeline up where the cottage is. In her latter years, she would go out with her friend Sis, who's a cousin, and they would drive all over the local sort of countryside down by the sea, and it gave her a great deal of independence. In around 2010, Eileen was unfortunately involved in a couple of minor traffic accidents. And because of this, insurance became involved and she was asked to produce her documents. It transpired that her driving licence was many years out of date. And I don't know all the ins and outs, but she was told that she would have to retake her driving test in order to gain a full licence. Now, when you live in the middle of nowhere and you can't drive a car, then you have a serious problem. So without a car, Eileen became a prisoner really at the cottage. Her closest neighbours over the road, the Rabins, Ted Rabin had died I think in 2009 or 10, and Aileen Rabin had moved to Clonakilty. So the houses that were nearest to her were all unoccupied or they were holiday homes. Fortunately, Irish people are very kind, and the local shop at Union Hall, one of the girls used to bring her groceries over to her. Local neighbours, Anne would bring meals up to her in the evening, and local people in the village who'd known her were friends. They would also bring food parcels up there. There was a local gentleman who used the fields to put his horses on, and he would bring her bits and pieces and collect her pension for her. Added to these, you had people like Billy the postman, who would always pop in whenever he was passing up at Rena Greena. And also you had the local farmers who would also pop in if they were passing and so forth. And friends and family like Sis and Faulkner. So people are very thoughtful and very kind in Ireland, but obviously Eileen had now lost her independence very sadly for what was to be the last 3 years of her life. Now, on a happier note, I know I've gone off at a total tangent here, but I'll finish with this little tale that Eileen told me because it's worth a listen. When she was in her 30s, she worked over at Bantry Hospital. She was a cook there. It was a time she loved in her life. She had a boyfriend. She went dancing. Eileen never drank. She took the pledge when she was young, and she never drank a drop of alcohol. But my goodness me, she knew how to have a good time, and she knew how to dance. And her sweetheart at the time was Teddy, I seem to remember. Anyway, she had a great bunch of girls around her at Bantry Hospital, and one of them was due to take her driving test. But on the day, she was an absolute bag of nerves and didn't think she could go through with it. So Eileen, being Eileen, offered to take her place. And Julie did. Obviously, there weren't any photo ID at the time. I don't know how she got round the signature or anything else, but she took her friend's driving test and she passed. What makes the tale a little bit more amusing is that Eileen, in fact, never ever passed the driving test, because when she first had a licence, you didn't need to pass a driving test in Ireland. It was the same in Britain, I think, at the time. So a nice little story to end the driving saga on. So to go back to septic tanks, we decided that we wanted to infill the garden on the right hand side, and in doing so we could bury the septic tank and the subsequent pipe work that went to it. This seemed the best solution, gave us the best location for the garden, and levelled out all of the land directly around the house. So the digger was brought in, and as you can see, the land was built up to the same level as the existing land around the house. this seemed to make most sense to us. So what is a septic tank? Well, it's an underground watertight container. Ours is made of concrete. They do make them out of plastic and various other materials as well. It treats household wastewater and sewage naturally. It works by using gravity to separate solids from liquids, and it allows bacteria to break down the organic waste and then disposes of a cleaner liquid into a drain field which goes back into the land. It relies upon a simple, consistent process of settling and digestion. They're quite a clever, simple little bit of kit, really. They don't need too much maintenance, but should be emptied every 5 to 7 years, if not before. And they should be checked on a fairly regular basis. There's also certain laws regarding where they can be placed. I think it's about 10 metres from a watercourse, 15 metres from any building, and 50 metres from any water supply. Of course, the advantage is that once they're paid for, then that's it. No bills for wastewater apart from your maintenance of the septic tank. So here we are back at the cottage in 2023. You'll see the chimney stack on the left hand side is missing, and there's a new one been built on the right. You'll also see that there's scaffolding running across the front of the property. And now we'll take a walk going over the front, and you'll see that the ground's been scraped. The digger's been in and just cleared it of all the vegetation that was there on the right hand side. Now we go to the garden on the right of the cottage, and you can see the new septic tank on your left, and you can see there's a vent pipe on the right, a couple of vents coming off the septic tank, and you'll get an idea of how much the earth has been built up when you look at the slope on the right hand side of the septic tank. But the back garden now is pretty level, which is what we wanted. Some conifers in the back and foregrounds, quite often planted in Ireland. I think they act as windbreaks, but they're not on our land. And then we've got the telegraph pole where the electricity feed comes down. Looking at the left of the cottage from the front, you'll see the rear now, and you can see the new electricity box and the old cables hanging there. And you can see the back is pretty levelled out as well. This is a view from the field at the back. You can clearly see the extension there. And this is the new pump in the pump house. So that's all the electrical gubbins and the compressor and so on and so forth. And we've got a brand new lid there, so everything's nice and secure and waterproof. Now looking at the back of the cottage, you can see the missing chimney and the new stack. And then finally, this is a sweeping shot from the rocks outside the cottage. You can see the extended garden there, the level, and the septic tank, and the view over the rear of the property. So let's take a look around the inside, through into the porch. As you can see, the walls are in a pretty bad state of disrepair, as they are in most of the cottage. You can see that the ceilings have now come down, but more of that in the next episode. Thankfully, the roofing rafters and purlins, the horizontal supports of the rafters, are in good order, and the ceiling joists themselves are also in good order. The main fireplace there with the stove, which is obviously going, and then into the corner, this is where the hot press or the immersion heater is. I think the doors were jammed shut at this point. That will all be going, and we'll probably house the hot water cylinder in the same place. Through into the parlour now. obviously it's the same story in here, apart from the wallpaper seems to have stayed on a little bit better in this room. There's a picture rail as well running along the top of it, and that will also, it'll all be going because it'll all need replastering and it'll all need new electrics, etc, etc. Back into the main lounge again, and then into the front bedroom. Same story here. You can see the electrical socket there and some wiring that my dad did to make sure they had sockets in each of the rooms. And it's just the same picture over and over again with each room. I think they used sea sand for the plaster, and in using sea sand nothing really sticks to it, it kind of crumbles away, so that will need to be addressed. Through here into the second bedroom, you can see the crack on the right and the same issues again. But it's not, it smells a lot better in there. It's got a sense of being quite a bit cleaner now, and you can begin to see some sort of progress beginning to be made. The floors made a huge difference. This area here would have been the old back porch, and then the doorway to your right, which now goes to the kitchen extension, would have gone straight outside to the backyard. You can see the ceiling's been cut into for the electrics, and we've got a temporary box there which feeds a couple of sockets. That'll be useful for the builders. This is the pantry. We will take this out. The arrangement in the kitchen I will go through on another episode, but it's a bit fussy and it doesn't really flow. So we'll be knocking the wall down here and making one large kitchen of it. For the moment it's handy just to store a few bits and pieces in from the house. And then finally, this is the bathroom. This is in pretty reasonable order. Obviously the suite's pretty old, but the walls and that are in quite good order, and this overlooks the garden to the right hand side, so that's where the septic tank went in, and that's where the electricity pole is. And then this is the corridor to the back door, and then you've got the pantry we've just passed, and then into the kitchen. That's the current arrangement. So that ends part 3. I was intending to talk about chimneys, I was intending to talk about ceilings, but I try and keep these videos to under half an hour, and I've basically rabbited on about this, that and the other. I hope you've found it interesting and informative, and I'm going to guess if you didn't, you haven't stayed watching till this point. So I'll look forward to seeing you next time. We'll start with chimneys and we'll start with ceilings, and we'll see where that leaves us. I've got a suspicion it might be roofs as well. So if you've enjoyed it, tune in next time, and I'll look forward to seeing you then. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Goodbye.